Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome on board. Thanks for being here with me. I really do appreciate you choosing to spend a little bit of your time with me, whether you're actively drawing alongside this video or just letting it play in the background while you relax. Either way, thanks so much for joining me. Today's video is a time-lapse illustration of the upcoming card game Cataclysm. I've talked about this pretty much in the last 6 videos because I was commissioned to draw 22 or 23 cats. So this, I guess, is number 7 or 6 actually. Sorry, like I'm behind the scenes, I'm already working on number 7, but this video is officially number 6. So for the next, let's say 20 minutes or so, you'll see this character slowly take shape from a blank piece of paper to a finished piece. While we look at this happening, I wanted to talk about something that comes up constantly in creative work, but rarely gets discussed honestly. The messiness of the process itself. So not the polished result, that get posted online, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the very awkward, uncertain middle stages that every single piece of art goes through. Before we get started though, a very quick thank you to everyone supporting the channel over on Patreon. Your support really helps keep these videos going. Patrons get early access to bonus content, and you get art merch drops up to 4 times a year. So if that sounds interesting to you, the link is down below in the description. And if you just enjoy art or just enjoy hanging around with me, talking away about art, do hit that like and subscribe button. It really, really helps. So with all that out of the way, welcome back to another Butcher Shop. So last week I had a very special guest on the show. His name was MK Gibson, and we talked about trusting the process, which is advice that gets repeated a lot in creative spaces to a point where it becomes a cliche, like one of the worst cliches ever. When somebody says, trust the process, at this point you're no longer sure if somebody makes a joke or mocks you, or if they're actually trying to encourage you. But it's something we discussed very extensively. And I heard you guys saying that you really enjoyed these guest features. So while I'm recording this one, I'm also trying to figure out a schedule to record a couple more episodes with my good friend and fellow artist MK Gibson. So stay tuned for that. But yes, so trusting the process. It is such a weird thing to say to someone. Because like I said, at this point you don't know if somebody's mocking you or if they're actively trying to encourage you. And it almost sounds like, as long as you keep showing up and keep doing the work, eventually anything that is shit will come out right. And there is this sort of weird duality in here that I want to dive in today's video. Because what people don't always mention when they talk about art or when they talk about trusting the process is the way it looks while you're inside the process. Most of the time, the process, revolving around art does not look graceful at all, nor does it look inspiring. A lot of times it is very messy and is very uncertain, and occasionally it can be very discouraging. So if you've ever drawn anything from sketch, you already know this feeling. You start with a blank canvas or a blank piece of paper, and you have this vague idea, and for quite a while, what you're making does not resemble the thing you had in your mind at all. The proportions are off, the pose feels stiff, or your colors just don't match the feeling you want to convey. Every adjustment you make seems to create 2 new problems somewhere else. And it's very easy to, in that moment, assume that you're doing something wrong. Over time, though, I think I've come to realize that this very awkward stage is not a mistake or a detour or you messing things up. It's not something that happens because we are inexperienced or we are careless. I think that entire process is simply what makes things good in the end. So I'm trying to differentiate here between, showing up and doing the work and turning shit into something, and being critical while you're in the process, because it's not just about doing something, any fool can do anything. I think the key here is to keep on doing things, or keep on creating, keep going through that creative process, while also actively remaining critical to what you're doing and to reflect on what you're doing so that you can do it better with each iteration of that process. So, if that sounds complicated, I'm going to try and break it down and talk a little bit more about what I mean with this. So today is really all about learning to, embrace that mess rather than fighting it. Because once you stop treating, that messy part, that messy middle part like an enemy, I think the creative process becomes a lot less intimidating, and it will really create, or at least I believe that it will create a sense of freedom, to experiment and to try things and to just be you as an artist, warts and all. If you've spent any time looking at art online, you mostly see finished work. You see the clean and the final image with perfect lighting and very confident brushstrokes, but what you rarely see are the 20 or 30 versions that came before it. And this is just another thing where I personally have this sort of love-hate relationship with any form of social platform, because as a small artist, you are kind of depending on it. It's where you find your customers in a way. But at the same time, it also forces you into certain formats, because some people are just not interested in, seeing what you've been through in order to get to that final product, which they might potentially be interested in. But it has also ruined our understanding of, how art is being created. We only see, maybe if we're lucky, that little bit of the beginning, and then maybe like a quick 2-second shot of the middle part, and then ta-da, here's the final piece of art. And because of that, it is very easy to develop this sort of quiet assumption that experienced artists somehow skip that ugly bit in between, start and finish. It's as if they sit down and everything they touch just works and turns into gold, first try. But in reality, if you opened any artist, work file, or, if you look at any of their canvases halfway through a piece, you'd probably be surprised about how chaotic everything of it looks. There are rough sketches layered on top of each other. Sometimes you erase something so hard that you tear the paper, but you don't want to chuck it away because what you have there in the baselines is kind of fine, and we'll roll with it. We'll fix the tear, we'll digitally erase it. Abandoned ideas are sometimes shoved off to the sides of the canvas. Colors are tested and repainted. Entire sections are erased and redrawn, and it often looks less like a plan and more like some sort of negotiation. Like we are negotiating, okay, well, if it looks like this, then, maybe I can do that to sort of cover that up. It's this constant conversation with yourself, between a part of you that wants perfection and the part of you that knows that perfection is just impossible to achieve. So you kind of go for that in between once you feel like you've reached that. Maybe this sounds very detailed, and that's pretty much because I think it's okay. So this might be a very personal thing. This is very much what my process feels like. I know I am not the artist that will create a masterpiece, but I do know that I have a lot of fun while creating, and I try to get better. And that basically means that I too have this sort of awkward middle. And what do I mean by awkward middle? It's kind of where things get almost psychologically tricky. Because in the beginning, everything feels open and exploratory. And at the end, you're refining details and things feel very satisfying. But the awkward middle is where the sketch has been cleaned up enough that you've committed to it. You've decided to go and see it through the end. but at the same time, what you've painted or what you've colored is not developed enough yet to look good. Your colors are wrong, they feel flat, your lighting hasn't come together, everything feels sort of detached from each other. And it's the point where the piece kind of looks worse than it did as, this sort of doodle beginning. It's the moment where most of my self-doubt, at least, shows up. I start wondering, if the whole idea was maybe bad. And I start comparing it to finished art that I either admire or that I've made before. And I feel like I've sort of fallen short, as if I'm devolving into someone or into an artist that is not as good as she was. It feels like I'm going backwards. And I don't know, man. It forces me to sort of really, really push myself onwards instead of just abandoning the thing altogether. And I think that a lot of unfinished projects die right on that moment. Not because the idea was flawed, but because the artist mistook this normal transitional stage for failure. And I don't think it's failure. I think it's construction. This is process, If you walk through a building site, halfway through construction, it would not look beautiful yet. There would be exposed beams and there would be wires and maybe there's like sewage pipes coming out of walls. Who knows what else? And the weird thing is that, through that example, we understand, the building is still being constructed, still being created. It's not finished yet. And for some reason, that is easier to accept than when we are in the middle of a creative process. Illustration works the same way. Sometimes we have sewage pipes sticking out of our work. And we just gotta face the fact that those will be, worked around. It will be... Oh my god, this is just a wrong example, but you guys know where I'm going with this, right? It is a work in progress. So I think what I'm trying to say is, personally, when I started recognizing that this ugly middle phase was kind of inevitable rather than exceptional, I stopped feeling like it was a warning sign. It became something that I could simply work through with the experiences that I've had over the last 20 years. It's like filling up your backpack with fixes for different types of problems. And every time you bump into a problem, which is basically what this entire stage comes down to, is the more you do this and the more you deal with these problems, the more fixes you have in that little backpack. So it becomes easier in a way, and that does not mean that there will be a time where I don't struggle with any of that at all. I think the whole point is to struggle and then to critically think what can be a solution. And sometimes you've been through that solution before, so it's easier to sort of, put one and one together. And sometimes you have to reinvent the wheel, I love that part of critical thinking, and I love that part of art where you're constantly problem solving. And I don't know, call me an idiot, call me a millennial. I don't know, whatever, give it a name. But I think that is a skill, problem solving is a skill that we don't spend enough time and energy in anymore. But that's me getting old and, everything was way better way back in the days and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the way you work through this is rarely as dramatic as it feels. It's not some big burst of inspiration, where everything suddenly fixes itself. It is very small and they're very practical adjustments made one at a time. Maybe you tweak the silhouette, or you make the pose just a little different so that it reads more clearly, or you shift the color palette so the character stands out from the background. You dig into this whole bucket of color theory, and you might want to repaint your lighting until the face kind of lights up. None of those changes are really exciting on their own. They're very small and sometimes very tedious. But stacked together, they really start to transform a piece. And I think this is something I wish more people would talk about, because we often romanticize creativity as this lightning bolt experience, like this eureka moment where we have an idea and magically it appears on the paper. Whereas in reality, most of it is just quiet problem solving. It's patience. It's sitting with an image and asking, okay, what's the next small thing I can improve? Going back to some of my previous videos where I explain, why I work in segments so much, it's because it is easier to focus on a little segment compared to the whole thing. I know there's a lot of artists who use large color areas and they refine and they come down to details further and further. Whereas my technique is it's almost like paint by numbers. You have this segment and you fill in this segment first, and you just color that and you render it as far as you can, before starting with the next segment. And I am very aware that this is exactly what causes things to sometimes feel very disjointed. So it always sort of requires this final layer with light and dark, so that the shadow parts and the light parts all come together. I am very much aware of that, and that it might not be a very conventional way of working either, but it is just what I've learned to sort of use. It's something that I've learned to make work for myself. And it doesn't mean that everybody should work like this. God, no, please find your own way of doing things. If I can inspire you, that's great, but don't in any way feel obliged to try this out, But the point is, even in my, in the overview of my process, I work in these tiny bits that pile up into something, finished, something big, something that is all coming together. So I think that's the most important part to understand, is that change does not come like a bolt of lightning. Change comes by doing things bit by bit, and to keep doing things bit by bit, because that's how you get through the end. All right, so let's get down to business for a second, and let's think about what really helps, to get past that awkward feeling, that uncomfortable feeling in that middle part. For me, what really helped was remembering to treat drawing, or to treat art in general, like play rather than a performance. Even if you're working on commission or you work with clients, approaching it as a performance just increases the amount of pressure that you will experience while working on it. While you're working on something lighthearted, like a pirate in a card game, for example, it's a good reminder that not everything has to be serious or perfect. There is room to experiment, and there is room to exaggerate and try slightly ridiculous ideas just to see what happens. Some of the best details in my work have come from moments like that. Adding a little bit more gesture to the pose, or pushing the expression farther than feels safe. Testing a color choice that might be a little too bold, and if it doesn't work, I can always undo it. Nothing is permanent. Speaking of pushing expressions further than feels safe, you should really, really stay tuned and hit that bell button, because next week I have a cat for you that goes way over the top with facial expressions. So yeah, practice what you preach next week. Stay tuned. Anyway, so approaching art with that mindset of, making mistakes is fine. It makes it easier to make it feel like an exploration, rather than evidence of that you're failing. Does that make sense? Well, I mean, ironically, that freedom often leads to better results, because you're not so tense about getting everything right in the first try. I really think that's the magic of the whole thing. Once you understand that making mistakes is fine because it forces you to be better and to, solve the problem and to make another iteration where you apply what you've learned. Once you understand that's play, that's the fun part, it makes life so much easier. Over time, I've started to see this mess as kind of a positive sign. When my canvas is covered in notes, or my reference images are, scattered all over the place, and my sketch contains nothing but half erased lines, dozens of layers. I don't even want to talk about the layer mess right now. But it means that I'm actively thinking and adjusting. And it is, again, I'm thinking back while I'm recording this. And in the very beginning, my digital files had only one layer because I approached it as in the same way that I would with like acrylics painting or, normal traditional paint. I would do everything on the same layer. And if it didn't work, I would just paint over that layer. And now I'm at a point where I have anywhere between 3 or 30 layers just to make things work, just to, create some sort of effect, or sometimes even to just help structurize things for myself. It's such a weird thing to say of yourself, but I think that process has come a long way for me in the last couple of years. And the reason I'm saying this is it didn't feel wrong at the time, and now I look back and I'm like, how dumb was I, but why did I do everything on the same layer? You have this convenience of working digitally. Why didn't you make use of that? Whereas, on the other hand, I can also kind of admire the sort of stubbornness behind it. Like, well, I'm used to working with paint, so why would I approach digital painting in a different way? But through that, like over the years, I have developed this need for layers. I know, this is a detour. I get it. What I'm trying to say is process takes time. Progress takes time. A perfectly clean file usually means that you just haven't started yet. And I think that's the bottom line of what I wanted to say here. I had just this one layer, and I made illustrations, and I don't know, looking back, they don't feel like they've come alive as much as my recent work. So I think I was making art, but maybe I just hadn't really started yet, So instead of aiming for neatness, I think you should aim for progress. Eventually, and this always happens more gradually than you expect. Like this for me took, I don't know, about 5 years. It was simply the accumulation of all those messy and imperfect steps. Every rough sketch, every repaint, every small correction contributed to that final image. And it all led me to this period of time, because I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it led to me in the now working with layers in a way that I'd never done before. And I think my work has gotten better because of that. So, you can approach everything that I've talked about by way of looking at a single piece of art, but you can also, let this whole speech, this whole monologue loose on a much larger field of view, your entire career, even a year or a couple of years. This goes for everything, and it is very applicable to everything within the creative process on a small scale, but also very, very much on a larger scale. That's why I think learning to embrace that messy stage is so incredibly freaking important. If you're constantly trying to avoid it, or you're rushing past it, or you're just going to end up fighting the very thing that makes improvement possible. I truly believe the mess is where you learn. It's where you experiment, and it's where your decisions actually start shaping the piece. It's not something standing between you and the art. It is the art. And with that, I think our tiny little swashbuckler is almost ready and finished, ready to cause some trouble in Cataclysm the game. If you've been working on something while watching this, I hope your canvas looks a little chaotic right now, because that means that you're right in the middle of making something, and that's exactly where you want to be. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. Go ahead and check out my Patreon if you'd like some extra behind the scenes content, early access, or if you just want to support the channel. It genuinely helps, and I appreciate everyone signing up, even if you just sign up for the free account, because that exists too. Thank you so much for spending time with me here, and I'll see you in the next episode, back in the shop.